First of all, I want to thank Eric and Enthought and SciPy in general for the invite to do a keynote. This is always entertaining to give a talk where you guys will know more about some of this than I will, and the vice versa will be true for probably a larger amount of it. But I'm really happy to take questions, and especially if I use terminology that loses anybody, just ask for a quick clarification. We can do a definition on the fly. I try to de-jargonize whenever I talk to a general audience, but it's impossible to de-jargonize yourself completely, as you all know. Okay, so this is just an artist's rendition of the impact, which is actually out of scale, but it's always fun to show these kind of pictures. I have to give credit to a lot of people, and I see my slide is slightly cut off at the top and bottom, but this was a project funded by the International Ocean Discovery Program that is a consortium of something like 30 countries that basically drill scientific drilling sites around the planet. It was also co-funded by the International Continental Drilling Project because we were in such shallow water, we were practically on land. And so they gave us money for about $1 million out of the 10. And then Enthought and Weatherford Labs came together, and it looks like the labels have vanished on the bottom. But anyway, Enthought and Weatherford Labs came together and were able to help us do CT scanning at a very inexpensive rate, plus a lot of donated software and developer time and so on, to actually directly analyze these cores in virtual core, in a computer platform space where we could share it completely with the science party and let everybody have access to the core at the sort of 0.3 millimeter scale around the planet, which was really exciting to be able to do, and I'll show you some examples of how that's borne fruit scientifically. Okay, so without further ado, what is this about? Well, this project is effectively a form of comparative planetology. What we mean by that is that study one planet to understand all the planets, or in this case, study one rocky planet and a process that occurs on rocky planets, which are impacts colliding with them over the history of the solar system, to understand how impacts work fundamentally. And if you're going to pick an impact, it's nice to pick an impact that has an effect not just as a process that it changes crusts of planets over time, but actually had a direct effect on us. And this one you could maybe make the argument if it hadn't happened, we wouldn't be here. So, you know, that's a useful one to go after. So that was what our pitch was. Amazingly, that pitch took 15 years to get funded, but eventually we got funded, and maybe you guys know about these kind of long visions, but it worked. So what am I talking about? Well, I'm basically talking about the fact that impact cratering is the fundamental process that resurfaces planets everywhere else but Earth as the most important, most dominant process. On Earth, we have water moving around, we have plate tectonics, we're changing our planet's surface on a very high rate. You know, every time a hurricane rolls through, it changes the surface, right? But on other planets, the dominant process is impacts, and it has been since the beginning of the solar system. So how do these fundamentally work? Thank you, whoever just fixed that. That was awesome. And what can we learn by studying a well-preserved impact here on Earth? And just to remind you that this is not only something in the past. On the left is early in our solar system's history. It's a phase called the late heavy bombardment, when there was a lot flying around in space and everything was getting smacked with regularity. It's interesting to note that the first life on Earth was at 3.7 billion years ago, right at the end of this phase. So maybe there's a link, maybe there was too much, or maybe the impacts helped life get started. Good questions. But they were very important early in the system, including here on Earth. And on the right, every one of those dots is a near-Earth object. This is today. Our planet's orbit is this light blue circle here. So we are wandering through a space filled with objects, and thus it's also worth, from a hazards perspective, thinking about what impacts can do to you. And this is actually probably about 5 years out of date. I think we know another million or so objects now. So, okay, so where does this all start from a science story? On Earth, it really starts with these two guys. This is Walter and Louie Alvarez. Walter is a geologist, or was a geologist at Berkeley. He's retired now. Louie Alvarez was his father, a physicist, Nobel Prize winner. And they had this cool idea to look in Gubbio, Italy, at this clay layer that sits, where's my cursor? There it is, right between these two layers of limestone. This layer is from the Cretaceous, which ended 66 million years ago. This layer is from the Paleogene, which started 66 million years ago. And there's this interesting clay layer in the middle, and they wanted to know how long it took to deposit this little teeny centimeter-thick layer of clay. So why don't we look at something that's constant, like cosmogenic radiation, always rains in from the outer space. If we simply measure how much is in this layer of clay, we make an estimate, we could probably say how long it took. Well, they picked exactly the wrong layer to do this on, to ask their question, because instead of finding some constant background, like 0.1 parts per billion, they found 80 parts per billion, right? So this thing is off the charts from a standpoint of iridium, which was the cosmogenic nuclei, element that they studied, which means it's impossible that this was background radiation. And instead, it had to have an influx from outer space to make it exist. And thus was born in 1980 a science publication saying, gee, this moment might have been an impact. Nobody had a crater yet. It was just iridium in a layer, but it turned out to catch the imagination. There were science books written. There was the end of the dinosaurs children's book was written. It was called T-Rex and the Crater of Doom, all that sort of stuff. And in one of those fascinating coincidences of science, in exactly the same year, this guy Jan Schmidt at the bottom here was also studying a layer in Tunisia and came to the same exact discovery. Only in his case, he sent the sample off to a lab, and they came back and said, we're sorry, your sample has got a problem, it's contaminated. And so he didn't get to write his paper until a year later when he said, well, that wasn't contamination, that was signal. And then he wrote his paper a year after that. So unfortunately, he didn't get the credit for it. He should have the credit equally with the Alvarez's. Fast forward 30 years, he actually got to join our expedition last year. So that was pretty cool, kind of come back around. Okay. So what are we talking about? We're talking about a global boundary layer that was laid down by an impact, and the crater was not discovered for another decade after that, and I'll show you that in a minute. But it's important to just think about what this layer looks like from the perspective of what I'm going to show you in the drill course. Because basically, if you're on the other side of the planet, it's a centimeter-thick layer that actually has evidence of the impact like iridium in it. As you get closer, it's a little more complicated. As you get closer, it's a lot more complicated. You start seeing things like tsunamis and earthquake evidence and things like that. And as you get really close to the impact, it's a mess. And everybody kind of knew that, but it was an understanding of exactly what are the processes that build these layers. And obviously, as it thickens towards the Gulf of Mexico, there was some knowledge the crater had to be somewhere in the Gulf of Mexico. Here's a great example from a core off the east coast of the United States. That was drilled by the Ocean Drilling Program, a predecessor of the International Ocean Discovery Program, where you can see a nice example of the kind of, whoops, come back, where you can see a nice example of the sort of features in there. So prior to the impact, there was actually less diverse life, very large organisms living in the ocean surface. So these are actually basically plankton that were living at the time. Then you have this crazy boundary layer that has things like glass balls in it called spherules, has shocked minerals in it that have seen pressures in the millions of PSI, and then a fireball layer at the top with iridium and dust and ash and soot and all these kind of exciting things from the impact. And then after it, a complete change of life. 95% of the lower stuff went extinct. Only 4 species of those guys survived, and only 2 of them actually took off to populate the entire world's oceans since then. So it's a big change. Here's the actual impact crater, which was eventually found by gravity modeling. So the anomalies from the impact relative to the gravity of the planet lit up, and you can actually see the circular structure. And so we've gone out a couple of times now as geophysicists to image this. One of the lines is here, shown in white. This is a seismic line looking down into the subsurface by about 10 kilometers. And what you see are all these big faults offsetting the Cretaceous layers falling into the crater. And you can see this big bump here in the crater. This bump shows up as this lit up ring here. And this is actually basically a buried ring of mountains in the center of the crater. That's exciting because only the largest impact craters ever have those. They're called peak rings, and we don't know how they're formed, or we didn't until we drilled last year. It's the best preserved large impact crater on the planet. The other 2 of this size are 2 billion years old. So what we think happened 66 million years ago, a 14-kilometer diameter, or 10-mile wide, roughly, diameter, 9.5-mile wide, hit the Yucatan, which at the time was a relatively shallow sea, a few hundred meters deep. And 75% of life overall went extinct, with even greater percentages in the surface ocean. Something like 90% of the ocean went extinct, but maybe 5% in rivers, so it's quite variable. Everything larger than about 60 pounds goes extinct on the planet. That's interesting. Our ancestors are amongst the survivors, and fast forward in 66 million years, and we have a science party so we can go study it. This is good, right? So what were our goals? This is a full waveform seismic image. This is kind of moving into the high-tech world of seismic imaging, basically taking every bit of energy that comes back when people set out energy sources from, say, air guns and things and bring them back onto sensitive listening devices that we tow behind ships in the oceans, and then create images that tell us what effectively the density, if you will, of the rocks are. It's really the velocity of sound in the rocks, but it's an equivalent. And then overlay it on a really well-made image. What you can see are some real details of the site that we decided to drill. So this is that peak ring, this ring of mountains. Notice it's got this crazy flat, smooth top. Notice there's a light blue layer in here, which is very low velocity, low density. What's that? And then you can see all the layers above this. There we go. Keeps losing my cursor. There it is. You can see that the peak ring itself is almost featureless. You can't see a density contrast at all in it. But above it, you have all these layers, and those individual layers are the limestone layers that buried the crater in the ensuing 66 million years. So our goal was to start drilling at about 500 meters down, well, drill down and start coring about 500 meters down, collect the limestone layers that laid on top of it to get a sense of how life recovered, and then drill into the peak ring through whatever that light blue stuff is and down into the peak ring proper, in order to ask sort of three very basic questions. How is it that you make a peak ring? How do impacts fundamentally work? What caused the environmental changes that led to 75% of the planet going extinct? And what effects do impacts have on the subsurface communities in the ocean, in the crust? Basically, we know that there's this enormous ecosystem that lives below the surface of the planet. It's estimated it's far larger than what lives on the surface of the planet. Mostly bacteria and archaea and all kinds of interesting things like that. How do they get affected by this? And the reason we ask that question is an origin of life question. Is it possible life started because of energy driven by impacts and chemical exchanges driven by impacts, as opposed to the current prevailing theory where life started at mid-ocean ridges? So that was our third goal. Okay, so I'm going to go through these goals really quickly, and then I'll show you some of our results. And how we actually use this CT imaging and the cooperation with this community. So the first thing to see is a picture of what a peak ring type crater looks like on the moon. So this is Schrodinger Basin on the moon on the left. You can see that there's a basin that's largely flat, probably filled with impact melt and debris and all kinds of stuff. But poking up in the middle of this basin, you can see this ring of mountains, right? That thing is a peak ring. And there are were two competing theories as to how you make an impact that looks kind of low and flat like this and how you make a ring of mountains. Now, to give you a sense of scale, on Earth, those mountains were 1 to 2 kilometers high, right? The edge of the crater when first formed might have been the height of the Himalayas before it collapsed, right? So these are not small mountains. The two theories are that everything is basically driven by melt. And so that's this theory on the left called the impact melt crater, where nested melt hypothesis, where it hits, things really melt. And in this case, melt is not necessarily by temperature, but by pressure. If you hit things hard enough, you can make them melt. So it takes 60 gigapascals or 9.6 million PSI to do it. But impacts have that much energy, just if that helps your brain. I'm not sure it does. I'm not sure it helps mine either. The idea was that there's so much melt, it actually impedes any kind of a rebound process. And the way you make a crater is basically things just collapse from the side, and you make a crater where things like that ring of mountains would be made of just shallow material that fell in from the side. That's one theory. The alternative theory is it hits so hard that all the way through a much larger section of the crust, things act like temporarily act like a fluid, like a slow-moving, viscous fluid. And in that world, you can think of it like throwing a rock in a pond, where when you hit, you basically make a hole, if you will, that immediately starts rebounding upwards. There is some impact melt on the top of it, but largely it's not enough to stop this rebound process. It rises, say, on the Earth scale, maybe 10 kilometers above the surface of the Earth, and then collapses backwards, such that this ring of mountains would actually be made of material that came from deep and is now at the surface. That would matter because if this is the way it works, then planets are resurfaced by impacts over geologic time. They're like a giant gardening system. And surfaces of planets are constantly being rejuvenated by impacts, if the guy on the right's correct. So which is it? And how do you test it? Well, if you drill into the peak ring, and in this case it's shallow stuff, well, in the Yucatan, that would mean it would have been made of limestone. If it's the deep stuff, well, it would be made whatever's below the limestone. So not to give it away, we're going to go see what it's made of. Okay, next question, mass extinction. So you know a big impact hitting like that is bad day locally, right? You also know it's a bad day for the entire Gulf of Mexico. What you see plotted in colors here is a thickness map of all the sediment, all the rock that collapsed into the Gulf of Mexico because of the impact. And it's the largest single event deposit on the planet. The estimates of the kind of energy involved are magnitude 10 earthquakes, so larger than tectonics can produce, 500-meter plus high tsunamis, hurricane force winds, everything's incinerated by its shock wave out to 1,000 kilometers. You know, it's a bad day, right? But why did it kill things all over the planet? That's the research question. Why does the other side of the planet care, right? So that's one of the things we wanted to study. You know, here's just an example of that. You know, this is the Cretaceous on the bottom, kind of a picture of, if you will, fauna and flora, you know, plants and animals here, going extinct and new ones kicking off because of whatever this event is. And if you measure global productivity of life, whether you measure it by the amount of calcite, i.e. limestone, or you measure it by a carbon isotope, either way, everything freaking crashes, right? This was a big deal. And you can see it exactly coincides with the moment of the impact. And just to set something else to rest, there is no major, there was a single flow of the Deccan Trap volcanism on the other, not quite the other side of the planet, but it is not any bigger than any of the other ones, and they happened before and after. So there's not a coincidence with that and this event. There is a coincidence with the impact. Okay, what are the potential killing mechanisms? Maybe we heat up the surface of the planet by incoming fast stuff ejected out of the crater. Maybe we cause darkness by the debris in the air. Maybe we cause some kind of a nuclear winter scenario by release of things like sulfur, in the same way that Krakatoa caused a year without a summer, Pinatubo caused a year without a summer. Big volcanoes can do it. What about an impact? How long can it do it for? Maybe we acidify the ocean because of all the carbon put into the atmosphere. Sound familiar today, maybe? Just saying. Or maybe we even induce a whole lot of metal poisoning into the ocean. So these are ideas. Here's just a model for fun of Europe getting hit by the ejecta. Here comes the pressure waves through the atmosphere. Here comes the ejecta 6,000 kilometers away from Chicxulub. The red are the larger, if I get it right. No, the red are the smaller. The yellow are the larger. And the little yellow particles you'll see will actually rain out pretty quickly, and the red ones will get stuck up in the atmosphere at about the base of the stratosphere, 50 kilometers or so up. And is that enough to basically cause a kind of artist rendition like you see in the bottom right? You know? And the other question, of course, is when this stuff starts raining out, how much thermal effect is that? Is that actually heating things up? And there's been a lot of evidence of soot and scattered wildfires associated with the impact. So estimates from anything from sort of toaster oven for a couple of hours to a pizza oven for several hours, you know, but it's enough to potentially incinerate a significant amount of combustible material. And if you're big, you got a problem because you can't get out of the way. If you're little, maybe you can hide in the ocean. Maybe things living in the bottom of a stream do okay, you know, things like that. So these are some of the ideas that we'd like to look at. In the microfossil world, and looking at the plankton that live in the ocean, we see an enormous difference when we look around the planet at these things. So 30,000 years after impact is the first time we see brand new evolution of life in the plankton world. And if you look, say, 3 million years after impact, you can see it's an entirely different evolution of life. So we can look in the core scale at evolution of life in terms of the plankton as a proxy for life on the planet in a sense. Okay, last one is to look at whether life likes impact craters. And by this I mean life living in the subsurface. So this is the question of whether or not when you put that much energy and that much chemical exchange moving through the crust, which has probably had enhanced porosity because of being hit and fractured and moved, do you actually make a niche for life, for exotic life, to take a hold in the subsurface. And we have evidence that that has happened in the past. This is the Chesapeake Bay impact crater. I don't know how many people know that lying beneath Chesapeake Bay is a giant impact crater, 85 kilometers across, happened 35 million years ago. But they drilled it. They hit a giant block of material that fell into it at the bottom. And in that block of material, right there, they found an ecosystem that had evolved since then, but was unique to impact craters. So it got kicked off by the energy of the impact 35 million years ago, and it's still living there now, which makes it a really interesting question. Could impacts get things going as far as life on Earth goes? Okay. Oh, and I guess the other picture here was just to say peak rings might be a good place to drill for that, because you can envision fluid flow moving upwards into such a promontory. Okay, what did we do? So we went out with a lift boat and we drilled off Progresso, the longest pier in the world location, 6 kilometers long, to get to 7 meters of water depth in order to pull a cruise ship up. So we were about 25 kilometers off in about 20 meters of water, 60 feet or so. And for 2 months, jacked up on legs to drill. This is a shot of that. Amazingly, this thing here is how you get on. They call it the Widowmaker in Spanish. So you literally hang on, and they lift you up and over, and they drop you onto the, it's kind of fun. I loved it. Other people were not excited, but anyway. And then we spent 2 months out there. These are shipping containers, which were doubled as our labs. We live 6 to a room, so it's not posh being a scientist at sea sometimes. And each one of these containers had desks and labs and microscopes and ways to measure the physical properties of the cores, et cetera, et cetera. So we did that for 2 months. The cores were not split offshore because there's no space to do that. They were left whole. And they, and I'll show you in a minute what happened in between, but once they were sent back to land, they eventually went to Bremen, Germany, where there was a full suite of labs set up to look at the cores. And the entire science party of 32 people came, plus a lot of technical help, and we split the cores and we sampled them for research and we described them and so on and so forth to do the full suite of measurements on, initial measurements on these cores. The fact that they aren't split offshore and it takes something like 3 months before they get to Bremen allowed a moment of opportunity that through Enthought's partnership, we were able to go and get those cores CT scanned with a state-of-the-art medical-style CT scanner, in this case with dual energy, in order to be able to do some virtual analyses of these cores as well. And this was an incredible opportunity made available by those logistics and then made available because Weatherford gave us an incredible price and Enthought donated their time to the project, which was wonderful. So I will show you some results of those in a few minutes. What did we get? Well, we started drilling at about 500 meters down. Started coring. We just drilled ahead for 500. Then we started getting cores 500 meters down. And we went all the way down to 1,335 meters or so on our way to a mile. And we saw about 115 meters of the limestone that buries the crater. Then we saw about 130 meters of whatever this light blue stuff is, which I'll show you a picture of in a minute. I'll call them impactites right now, rocks made by the impact. And then we actually got 600 meters of the peak ring itself, 580 meters. I'll show you pictures of those. So moving down, these are just pictures of the limestone. Turned out most of this was in what's called the Eocene, which is the hottest time in the last 66 million years. So people are interested in that for climate research. And I'm just going to skip through that pretty quickly. Then we actually got what are called black shales on our way down. Black shales are very important to study because these are the times when the ocean gets screwed up. It gets so hot, ocean acidification takes over, the ocean goes stratified, lots of things die. So this is the nightmare scenario of our future that people want to study by studying this event, something called the Paleogene-Eocene thermal maximum that happened roughly 55 million years ago. So we did capture that. So that's a useful piece for climate research. And then below that, we got into the end of the limestone. We hit this funny brown layer, which I'll look at in more detail in a minute. And then we got into whatever that light blue material was. This is that transition. Here's the limestone as we come down, hit this funny brown layer, which we'll talk more about in a little bit. And then right below it, we hit something that looked like a sandstone, looked like particles of sand with black flakes. Turns out the black flakes are actually impact glass. And when we look at a CT image of these cores, you can see that there's bedding that's kind of cross-cutting each other. This is symptomatic of what a tsunami deposit looks like. So 600-meter high peak ring has a tsunami on top of it. That's cool. It also says that the world ocean came back into the impact crater right away, enough with waves of tsunamis coming in, and we kind of knew there was already a hole in the edge, so we knew that was possible. But here's direct evidence of the energy involved of the impact, so that was pretty neat. As we move down through that layer, it just got more crazy. So this is, again, that light blue layer. Turns out it's super low velocity and super high porosity. So lots of pore space for fluids to move through. And the size of the particles in this thing just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. Some of these are actually impact melt rock rebroken. So it melted it, cooled it off enough, and then shattered it again in the space of minutes, which is kind of fascinating. And there are chunks in there of Cretaceous age limestone, and there are chunks in there of the original deep crustal rocks at the impact site. We actually tried to look at this from a standpoint of thinking about how it was all deposited, and you can generally see that the size of these things increase downwards. Here's kind of just a measurement of the size of the individual biggest chunks, the clasts we call them. And so we are now approaching this using virtual core and a machine learning algorithm that Brendan Hall is working on in order to ask the question, can we kind of quantify in a real way the size of every clast in there? And can we also quantify how round they are to ask the question whether was there water involved or not? So that's a new research direction to sort of go after this thing. And we can see that in the CT space, you can find the clasts are sometimes really visible to the eye, and other times they're actually like buried in the impact melt and even partially digested by the impact melt, but they're visible to the CT, which is really cool. So this is a shot of that machine learning algorithm where just a screen where we're trying it. We sort of classify the different clasts and then try to have the machine learning algorithm go through and tell you what they all are through the entire 130 meters of this. So that's a pretty exciting attempted research direction. Okay, so that is basically taking us through the limestone that bury the crater, through this light blue layer right here, which are these interesting broken up and melted rocks. What did we see at the bottom of that? What did we see when we got to the peak ring proper? Well, this is what we saw, which is impact melt rock. So this is actually rock that has seen that 9.6 million PSI and has actually been turned to a melt and then refrozen. And you can see that there's green and there's black. The green has got more carbonaceous material, more carbonate, melted material. The black is more siliceous, more quartz and things. And they're all kind of swirled together to give you a sense of the textures. Because we had the CT scans ahead of time and because they were dual energy, we were able to actually make products out of these things. So not just images of the core. So the top picture is a photo of the core. The bottom picture is the CT scan of the core, and the two in the middle are products, one saying approximately what the atomic number of everything in there is, the other saying approximately what the density of everything is in there. And so the describers at Bremen actually had the ability to see all this up front and describe their cores with 4 different images plus the core in front of them, which was an incredible boon for science. Now I'm going to do a little shout out to Lizzie Jones in the back, who is doing an internship with us. And it's amazing to say that a very intelligent 15-year-old can make 2,000 some odd images in 3 dimensions to show us what's possible when you have the capabilities of a 3-dimensional image of a core. This is that contact between the impact melt rock and the granite. You can see it in sort of different slices and an unwrapped version, and there's the photo on the right. And this is what it looks like in 3 dimensions with the CT scanned enhanced versions of different types of densities. And so you can see the complexity of the interface between these 2 rock types, which is going to be an exciting set of research directions. It looks broken, and that's because it is. It's faulted, so when it arrived as a peak ring, it didn't quit. It kept faulting for a while, which is interesting. That's probably those magnitude 10 plus earthquakes. But the key thing is, what is this here? Looks like your table countertop, right? It's granite. So that's not limestone, right? That's a deep basement rock in the peak ring. So going back to our hypothesis test, what did we find? We found something super deep. So it immediately points us to an answer. And in fact, we were excited enough about finding this granite that we actually wrote the paper before we split the cores. because we kind of knew this was a big answer. So it got published in Science last year in November, basically pointing out that the peak ring is made of granite, and therefore one of those two models is correct and the other is wrong. You can also see this granite is totally fractured up. In fact, you can take chunks of it in your hand and shatter it. It's not like normal granite anymore. It's been so damaged by these processes. Here are just some shots of it. There is some deformation in the granite that happened prior to the impact, but most of the deformation we see in the granite is all because of the impact. And it's all these different kinds of things. Things that are, cataclasites are like fault rocks. They're like gouge made by moving rock past each other and things like that. And again, we can find individual faults, just like you saw that picture of right at the boundary with the melt. And these are actually fault planes where the crystal growth tells you the direction the fault moved, which is pretty exciting. They're called the slicken sides. And here's some images, again from Lizzie, showing some things like this is a pre-impact dike. This was a dike of injected magma probably from 500 million years ago that then got damaged by the impact. And you can see all the contrasts of different crystals in there, as well as the actual dike itself. Another shot, this is of some of those brittle faults. You can see deforming the core, and in 3 dimensions, you can really get it to take a look at what those fault planes look like. So this is all just early days, and we have a lot of opportunity here to measure all of these things and figure out their cross-cutting relationships, who happened first. You know, did the faults happen late? Did the faults happen early? These are questions we're now going after to understand how you actually move something from, say, 10 kilometers down, up in the air 10 kilometers, and into a mountain range, and then leave it as a big pile of rocks. What is that process that actually does that? Well, we have the capability by looking at these cores. We also found evidence of that high pressures. This is what's called a shatter cone. They're only found in impact craters. They require at least 8 gigapascals of pressure to form. It's basically runaway earthquakes. So an earthquake starts here, and as it starts propagating through the rock, it sets off a bunch more earthquakes, which sets off a bunch more earthquakes, which set off a bunch more earthquakes. And it's like a fractal pattern passing through the rock of pressure that leaves behind what's called the shatter cone. And if you go to impact crater museums, you'll find some that are like this big. And we just happened to, in the end of our core, snag that one, which is kind of amazing. But it's just sort of, you know, a great example of the pressures involved. Even better examples of the pressures involved are under a microscope. So these are biotite grains, they're micas that are kinked by the pressure wave, plagioclase grains that are fractured. You can actually see those fault rocks at the microscopic scale, and quartz grains that are shocked to the point that they've been moved on planes in at least 3 different orientations. So shock waves have moved through them. It's actually twinned the crystal. It's actually shifted the crystal at the lattice scale by the pressure. And that lower right one takes like 35 gigapascals to happen. So it didn't see the 9.6, it saw like 6 million PSI. But that's, you know, nothing on Earth makes anything like that. It requires impacts for that to happen. Nuclear bombs can make very small shatter cones, but they can't do that, for instance. This is a complicated slide, but I just want you to fuzz your eyes for a moment and just look at something. Let's just look at the porosity, which is the second column. Basically, what we see here is the porosity up in the limestone is in fact higher and drops as we move into the swavites. It actually, sorry, drops, it raises. It's something like 40% porosity. So 40% of it is just space in those melted impact rock zones. So there's a huge amount of opportunity for fluids to move through, which means a huge amount of niche space, ecosystem space for life. That's really critical. And then in the granites, we're looking at 10% porosity. Granites never have 10% porosity, right? I mean, if you look at a granite countertop, it's got at most 1%. Otherwise, it wouldn't keep the water from rolling through it, right? Water rolls off your granite. This granite, if you poured water on it, it would go right through it. And that's because of all this shock and damage that's occurred. Okay, so how do we do with this? Well, the first thing to say is that because we found granite in the peak ring, this model that you see up here on the right is now sort of the state of the art of how impact craters work. You can see this concept of a slow-moving response. By slow moving, though, notice the seconds clicking by. That this picture takes about 5 minutes in real time to run. And that is literally how long it takes to make an impact crater based on the observations we have. You make a hole, you rebound from the hole, you collapse outwards, and you make a peak ring all in about 5 minutes, which is kind of stunning. The end of that phase where it's just shaking is probably another 5 minutes. So it basically says to us that impact craters and other planets are that gardening process, right? And they were here as well. They're overturning the crusts of planets through time in a fundamental way. And that was a cool result. Next big result was this, this core here, where we see a tsunami at the top of that pile of broken and melted rock. So we know the tsunamis were hitting something like 600 meters high. And then we see coming up through this evolution of life in the plankton that we're still exploring. But it looks like that some life came back right away, and other life took millions of years to come back. And the difference of the ecosystem requirements of those different kinds of life might actually be a clue as to what happened to the environment. For instance, is ocean acidification a problem or not? That's the next big thing we're going after to see if we can figure that out. And we're also measuring it for things like trace metals. Was there metal poisoning? You know, what happened? One of the big things we can tell is that in the pile of rocks that lay below it, there is no evidence of any sulfur-rich rocks. And yet we know the target that hit was about 30% sulfur. And we don't see any in the pile of rocks left behind. So one possibility is sulfur is particularly good at being vaporized. And if that's true, then the nuclear winter scenario becomes even more promising as an impact one. If all of the sulfur goes into the atmosphere and we can create darkness for maybe 3 or 5 years, that's a good way to kill things off. You know, everything depends on the sun to one extent or another. We also think we see some evidence of the impactor in the rocks. These are lit up iron and zones at the top and at the bottom of the core. And we've also found lit up chromium in there that may have come from the impactor. So there's a suggestion that impact dust is back in the crater. The only way that's possible is if it took a trip around the planet and landed back in the crater, which would be cool if that happened. So we're still working on that. And we found lots of evidence of fluids moving through these rocks, these 40% porosity rocks, including things like hydrothermal fluids, these red things. And we found elevated cell counts inside the crater. And they're pulling DNA off them now. This is basically an ecosystem living still down inside the crater 66 million years later. So what is it? How did, you know, that's the key question. And again, going back to this, is this possibly helping us think about the origin of life? So that's a pretty cool result as well. So I'm going to leave it there and take any questions you guys might have. But because I'm a good scientist, you have to always say that there are alternative hypotheses out there, right? So, you know, we'll just leave that there. And I'll leave you some pictures of the course. Thank you.
Okay, we have a few minutes for questions. There's a microphone here. If you're interested, anybody have any questions? Or comments?
Yeah, back there.
How was the DNA not destroyed and remained in the cores?
Yeah, so yeah, he said, how does the DNA not destroyed? How did it remain in the cores? So the life that was present absolutely would have been incinerated, wiped out by pressure, you know, so on. But life is very mobile on Earth, right? So if you had bacteria living in the crust away from the impact, then amazingly, they somehow seem to be able to re-influx locations. And then because of the specific ecosystem, you know, the energy that's present, the chemistry that's present, you have a quick evolution of life. Bacteria can evolve on scale of minutes. So you can actually have a new ecosystem kick off by the little bit of influx of fluids from outside the crater, bringing a little bit of the starting, and then new life takes off. And so it wasn't present, the life we're looking at was not what was there, it's what moved in right afterwards, and then has evolved since. So, yeah.
Hi, I also work in the field of computed tomography, but for material science, and I can say that all the data analysis that was done is really impressive. And I was wondering if you were able to use off-the-shelf tools for this, such as Scikit-Image, for example, or Scikit-learn for the machine learning algorithm. And if not, do you have some lessons for these tools that, to make them more usable for big-scale projects like yours?
Yeah, so I think Brendan has started with scikit-learn, right? That's where he, pretty sure that's what he was doing, but now he's been, yeah, but he's writing new, you know, there are things that are not in there, like there's no rounding yet, right? That's a new tool.
So this is all analyzed using scikit-learn and scikit-image, but we all know that those are kind of basic tools, and whenever you apply them to a science problem, the impedance matching there, you do a ton of work to make it work for neuroimaging or whatever you're doing.
Yeah.
But, I mean, the amount of science that's been done in a short amount of time is because you're standing on the shoulder of
absolutely.
this room that made those tools and made it where we could move really quickly with it. There are interesting things. I mean, this core is 4 terabytes of 3D data, and that's just the CT. I mean, you make all of these offshoots as well. So you have to think about data size in that process when you do it. But we're using all of those tools.
Yeah. And it got, you know, some of these things were 90% of the way there. For instance, the grains, the center of the grains all showed up as one thing. But then we had a problem that the edges of the grains, because they're slightly diffuse, and at the edge of resolution, showed up as a different rock when we did the machine learning analysis. And it's like, well, we know that's not a different rock. It's the same rock, slightly damaged, right? So how do we teach it to, in a machine learning sense to help with that?
But anyway, if you run into difficulties with these packages, then it would be interesting to chat about it together. Thanks.
Absolutely.
Hey, that was great. Thank you. I kind of have sort of a secondary question. I'm curious what kind of drill rig you used and how hard it was to find a driller capable of doing this that isn't tied up on an oil and gas rig.
Absolutely. So great question. So the platform we use is called a lift boat. They are generally used not for drilling. They're generally used to park next to an oil rig and jack themselves up to the same height so you can cross-deck things inexpensively. What we've done, and this is the second time the International Ocean Discovery Program has done this, is they take one of these lift boats and they attach a land drilling rig to it and they cantilever it off the side. So you take an inexpensive land rig, put it on a fairly inexpensive marine platform, and by inexpensive, I mean tens of thousands a day as opposed to hundreds of thousands if it was a real drill rig, right? The other advantage of that is the land rig that we used is basically mining technology. So it's low weight on bit, super high RPM, right? And that actually worked phenomenally well for going through impact materials and granites and things like that because it cut a really clean, we got almost 100% recovery, which is kind of unheard of because of that rig. That rig is owned by the International Continental Drilling Project. It's in Utah, managed by a company called DOSAC. So they already have been flying around the world taking these land rigs to do science problems, and we were able to, you know, kind of leverage within the community to get these people with a lot of experience at drilling out there for 2 months.
And it was a rotary rig? Not like
a
Viper core rig or anything?
No. You can't Viper core into something like this. Okay. Yeah, it's a full, you know, and in soft sediments, you usually piston core, and then when you get down, you start rotary drilling. On these sediments, we just rotary drill from this top because it's cemented limestone at the surface. So no point in trying to hit it with anything.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I guess you have to consider forms of life that aren't DNA or RNA based. What do you look for in those situations?
Yeah, so they've really been going after DNA and RNA, but then, which is a challenge in and of itself because contamination is the nightmare, right? So they end up taking the very center, they take a chunk of our core and they have to break it to get the little piece in the middle, and then they wrap it with something that kills any DNA and RNA, and then they do a sample in the very, very center of that to see if they can find something pristine. And in that, they've extracted DNA 3 times. RNA is harder. They're working on it now. I don't know if it's just going to be successful. And then the other thing they're looking for is what's called biomarkers. So they're looking for evidence of life in other forms. You know, and there's various different ways, you know, different kind of proxies for life, different kind of isotopes. For instance, there's a proxy that comes off leaves that's a leaf wax that leaves a tracer in rocks are the kind of things that people can use. So they're all being looked at.
And also, are you looking for like current life or life that might have survived for a few million years and then died off?
So the life that survived for a few million years and died off is really hard to find at the bacterial scale. It's easy to find at the planktonic scale. If it leaves itself a fossil, no problems. And that business has been going on for decades, and they're really good at it, and we're doing that as a normal thing. The cutting edge thing is finding traces of life that doesn't leave a fossil. How do you figure out what that is? Yeah.
Thank you. Very cool to see. I'm a geophysicist, so I get very excited about seeing geophysical data.
Cool.
Have any follow-up 3D geophysical surveys been done trying to actually image the peak rings?
Yeah, so we had a 1996 2D seismic experiment with a 2D, so reflection, with a 2D refraction experiment on top of it. Then we had a 2005 2D reflection, so that's looking for the images in cross-section, and then a 3D experiment to study the velocity of the rocks.
Okay.
3D refraction. There's never been a proper oil industry style 3D survey of this. We've never gotten enough money. It's also very shallow water, so it's a challenge. It could be done, and I'm kind of hoping that I can write a proposal to do that in the next few years once enough results are out that people get excited enough to be willing to spend that money, because it'd be a few $1 million.
Has any electromagnetics been done?
None.
None. Okay.
Yeah, and that would be cool.
It would be. Thanks.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, sir.
Yep. My pleasure.